So, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is our second conversation about the legislative session, and today we're going to focus in on education. And we've invited Bella Davis, who's our reporter, to join us today. Bella covers Indigenous affairs for us. You might have seen her reporting in the past year in particular, on the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives here in the state. But she's also done education reporting for us and is going to be doing more education reporting in the coming year. So, and particularly with the backdrop of the ongoing issues around educational adequacy for us, Native students and a whole nother set of students that were identified in the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit back in 2018. We thought it would be great if she could join us today. Do you want to say something more, Bella, or say hello?
Yeah, I can say hi. I also just want to apologize. I think there's some minor construction happening in the apartment next to me, so any background noise, I'm sorry. But yeah, I'll say a little bit about myself. I'm Yurok. I was born in Northern California, but I have lived out here since I was like 3, grew up mostly in Bosque farms, partly Albuquerque too. And I studied journalism at UNM, and yeah, I've been here with In Depth for about a year and a half. So.
And we're glad to have you.
So, folks, so all of our attendees, thanks for joining us. And so we're doing these chats in kind of a webinar format, rather than a kind of a free-for-all Zoom with everyone. But we really would love to hear from you. So if you have any comments or questions, we'll be monitoring our Q&A screen. So please definitely weigh in, and we'll periodically check in there. So Trip, why don't we just get started right away on education? Education is like 42% of the budget.
Yeah, it's always been in the time that I've been in New Mexico, it's always been the biggest single ticket item in the state budget. And it's I think, as I recall, it's like the requests are around $4.4 billion this year. And so when you have the governor asking for 10.5 billion, legislature coming back with its own budget asking for 10.1, that's where you get the 42%. I mean, it's a massive part of the budget. And so, which is why we wanted to make one of these 5 webinars about education, because as Marjorie, as you mentioned, in 2018, we have this kind of landmark decision that found that basically, I think close to 75% of our student population in K through 12 were considered at risk, and that the state had not necessarily done a great job at educating these students. And part of that is, of course, part of that was the Indigenous population. So, big picture, we have education, which takes up a lot of the conversation around not only the budget, but also, education debates, curriculum, all sorts of stuff. What kind of curriculum is best for certain populations, which is also part of the conversation. Yeah, and so that's kind of like big. At the same time, you mean to go ahead and get into like where we stand in 2024? Like we talked about this a little before, but
yeah,
there are a lot of challenges here in New Mexico. I mean, they always, as far as proficiency rates, being able to, show proficiency in certain subjects, New Mexico generally falls at the bottom of the national rankings. Graduation rates, it's generally, low in the rankings. And so, and this is a perennial problem. This is not just new. And so, this is a situation that they've been grappling with for years and years, and how to address it. Then comes along the Yazzie Martinez case. And then in 2020, you get the pandemic. And so we have seen some things happen in the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 years. If you look at some of the charts and presentations from the Public Education Department to state lawmakers, and also kind of a summary of where things stand by the Legislative Finance Committee, you'll see that the student population being served by public schools has dropped by 18,000 since 2018-19 school year to this school 2022-23. So you've seen about a 5% population drop in those students that are being served by public schools around the state. Now, you watched the video of the public education secretary talking to lawmakers, and he ascribed the drop in population, I think, for the most part, to the birth rate. Is that right?
Yes, the declining birth rate in the state. We heard
Yeah.
with the declining birth rate. I mean, and it's part of some of the reporting we've been doing on rural health gaps.
Right.
And in that context, the declining birth rate in rural is particularly hitting rural New Mexico. There's a declining birth in the state as a whole. But so yeah, he just he kind of jumped right over the decline in the population of students and said it was due to the declining birth rate, and you could start seeing it in kindergarten. So we were wondering, you and I had been wondering how this kind of spike in chronic absenteeism in the state might factor into that, or how it might factor into graduation rates. But yeah, he attributed it to a declining birth rate.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think for the folks who are, watching us before this call, Marjorie, Bella, and I were talking about various things. And when we talk about the chronic absenteeism, it spiked during the pandemic years. And this is not just a New Mexico issue. It's a national problem. I've seen the New York Times write about it nationally, but we're having the same issue here in New Mexico where 9th and 10th graders are not showing up to class. There's just absenteeism. I think that was in one of the reports. And chronic absenteeism contributes to the dropout rate. And so the questions become, how do all these factors, chronic absenteeism, I would imagine that may be a factor in some of the drop in the student population. Versus just the birth rate. We don't know.
We don't know. But I do think it's notable that, I mean, we should say that New Mexico's graduation rate has improved quite a bit over the last decade. It's gone up 6.9 points since 2014. So that the graduation rate has improved, and if you kind of look at their data, since 2020, there's been kind of like this upward kind of trek of the
since 2014, right? Yeah.
2014, and then in 2020 it kind of levels out. And that's happened at the national level too. So there has been a big improvement improvement over the last decade in the graduation rate, but we're still, it's interesting is, but we're still at the bottom set of states for graduation rates. And because, the analysts note, they're like, well, other states have improved too. So it's like, so we're still like below the national average and in the bottom tier for around graduation rates. So it's kind of an interesting, but we have been improving.
Can I add something to, as you were talking, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think there's a question of whether the proficiency levels have risen at the same rate as the graduation rate. And if they have not, which I think some data shows, then there's a question about what is leading to the improvement in the graduation rate. So these are all questions these are just questions that we have as, reporters. We do not know the answers. And I think probably a lot of folks are, if they're paying attention to these large questions, are probably have maybe some of the same questions that we have.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the effort, so we know that, since you and I have started covering the Roundhouse, 2 decades ago now. I hate to say that, but I mean, it's been a long time. We've seen the state budget almost double, right? And since José Martinez, there have been massive investments in education. So all of this is an effort to solve this problem around poor education in the state, because it's so tied to economy, like what people can expect to earn once they graduate, if they graduate. There's, studies that show that high school graduates make a certain, on average, annual salary, and then the higher you go in your education, the more you make. And then we also always hear from companies and other people who do economic development that your workforce, an educated workforce, is so important. So all of this question of education and how important it is to raise parity among, between ethnic groups and other disadvantaged students is so important to their long-term like economic health and their ability to like have higher standards of living and whatnot. And it just really ties into the economic conversation in the state around how to diversify the economy. So it's a very like critical thing, these graduation rates and reading proficiency and math proficiency. And in some of the data we were looking at, the lawmakers passed what they call a structured literacy initiative. I think it was in 2019, that really, to focus in on elevating the reading proficiency levels in the state. And I think another thing he said in his presentation, which I thought was
the secretary, cabinet secretary, yeah,
was that there's been a 4% increase in the past year in reading levels, reading proficiency. So I mean, so there's a lot of I gathered a lot of excitement around this structured literacy initiative, which is this kind of wholesale kind of training of teachers and how to actually, through the science, what does the science show and how to teach people to read. They call it structured literacy training. So, I mean, I think there's some bright spots there of just this kind of laser focus on reading. And
so we have a few questions here that might, some of the questions actually have to do with this larger big picture kind of thing, which maybe we can handle here. Some of the questions, which, if you don't mind, one of the questions is where does the Yazzie Martinez litigation stand? And I think we have done, the last story we did was that the Attorney General Raul Torres wants to take over the Yazzie Martinez litigation from the executive branch, basically Governor Michelle Lujan Grissom's PED. And I'm not sure, Marjorie, you may have an answer, Bella, you may have an answer, I don't know, but I'm not sure where that stands right now. I think that that's probably conversations between those two agencies, the governor's office and, well, three, PED and the Attorney General's office. We don't know exactly where that stands. And then that's from Frank Lito, who, a friend of ours from way back when he was, now he's a publisher of two newspapers in New Mexico, Artesia News and the Rio Grande Sun. But part of that, we used to work with him when he was down at the Las Cruces Sun News. So thank you, Frank, for that question. And then Wendy Linebrink Allison, I apologize, asks, how many folks are registered in homeschool? We don't know the answer to that question. That's actually an interesting question as it relates to this drop in student population, I think. Now, the second question she asks is, maybe they transitioned to charter schools, but as I understand it, charter schools are actually considered part of public schools. So that's wrapped into this population that we're talking about, this drop in student population. Charter schools in many ways they are considered public schools in many ways. So I believe the population we're talking about.
That's my understanding. I mean, we'll have to look into that a little bit more deeply, Wendy. And then your next question, how many youth have left primary schools, gotten a GED, and began college early before they turned 18? That's a great question. And I think going along with that is also this whole dual education.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it's
that may be increasing statewide, is what I've heard, is that higher ed institutions are maybe trying to expand their dual credit programs. So that's a great question. I don't know the numbers, but that is something that is on our radar. Let's put it that way, as a news outlet.
These are all very specific questions that we.
Yeah, and some of the questions, I apologize, we cannot answer. We don't know the answer to some of these questions. We just don't. But thank you for asking them. We might follow up with them as we continue to report on education.
So the other thing we might want to just say is that part of the governor's budget request, it's an increase over last year. A part of it is 101 million to increase school days to 180 days. And that's been a bit of a controversy statewide. So we're it'll be interesting to see how that initiative plays out to increase the school days. But that's a big part of her budget increase, and then a 3% increase in salaries for teachers.
It must be said, as we talk about teachers, that everything I've heard is that there's this looming retirement boom that's coming. That's going to happen as older teachers just decide to retire, and who's going to fill those positions. It's similar, Marjorie, to you reporting around healthcare workers in the state. And I imagine part of the rationale for increasing salaries for teachers is that we're in national competition for teachers. It's not just internal to New Mexico. It's, in many ways, it's probably a competition across state lines for teachers. Now, people can debate whether that's a robust enough rationale, but
well, it kind of ties into what you're saying. One of the bills that we're tracking this session, which is it SB 39? Why don't we get into
let's bring Bella into the conversation now?
Because I think it's whenever I look at it, so education isn't really an area that is my big wheelhouse, but I do pay attention to a lot of these kind of higher order data points. And I think a central theme of the past few years has been, for us, given we have, an Indigenous affairs reporting kind of focus in particular, is tribal education, education towards Indigenous students, and Indigenous students, along with a few other student populations are central to the Yazzie Martinez case. And when you look at the data around like reading and math proficiency and graduation rates, it's clear, what the real need is there, that there's an investment in education for Native students because they lag behind other groups. And so then that brings in all kinds of questions around, well, whose ideas should come to the forefront around what that education should look like? Culturally relevant and whatnot. So, Bella, you've been tracking some bills for us, and you have written about some of these efforts already. Do you want to kind of give us a rundown of what's happening this year around tribal education?
Yeah, so there are a few bills to really be looking at, and you mentioned one of them, HB 39, I think it is, that would appropriate 27.6 million, basically to higher education institutions around the state, and that's really meant to bring New Mexico closer to compliance with Yazzie Martinez. And there's really a whole lot in HB 39, from teacher pipeline, development of culturally relevant curriculum, and so it's really expansive. But you talked about teachers, and that was one piece of the bill that's really stood out to me. Is there is quite a bit of funding in there that is meant for development of bilingual teacher pipeline development, and specifically native language teachers, which I did some reporting about back in 2022. Essentially looking at how Albuquerque Public Schools really has a lack of Native teachers compared to the number of Native students that they have. So I think it was for the school year 21 to 22 is what we were looking at. There were 10% of students in APS had tribal affiliations, but only 1.2% of teachers were Native. And I think that I was looking for the current school year, and that's improved by like half a percentage point since then. But it's a major issue, and it's one of the things that SB 39 is trying to get at. And there are a couple of other bills. There's the Tribal Education Trust Fund. And so the idea there is that annual interest earned on the fund would be used by tribes for language and career readiness programs, along with a lot of other needs that really depend on the particular tribe you're looking at. But it's really about tribes having more money and control to create truly, community-based, community-guided education programs. And so it's Representative Derek Linty, who's from Sandia Pueblo, is looking for an initial $100 million investment to get that fund started. And then Linty is also sponsoring another bill, HB 135, I want to say, that is connected to the Tribal Education Trust Fund, but is a little bit of a separate issue. So the second bill that he's sponsoring would change the way that money from the Indian Education Fund is distributed. So again, they're connected, but the Tribal Education Trust Fund doesn't exist. That's what they're trying to get started this year. But then there's also the Indian Education Fund, which is basically money from that's distributed under the Indian Education Act, the state Indian Education Act. And under that act, tribes can apply for education grants from the state every year for education grants, but they have to spend the money within a year. And there are a couple of reasons why that's difficult. And so a lot of the money ends up being unspent, and so it goes back to the state. And so this bill that Linty is sponsoring would change the way that distributions from that fund are made so that it would be automatic every year, and so that tribes could carry over any money that they're not able to spend within the year. And so that's really trying to get at kind of a similar issue as the Tribal Education Trust Fund, where kind of the current system makes it really difficult for tribes to build sustainable education programs.
And why is that? I mean, so what is the argument there? I mean, why is it important so this education trust fund would be if there's 50 million there was 50 million in the recommendation from LFC. We don't know what the actual budget will show, but there's a request that in Linty's bill that he's for 100 million. And then, so that would be like, I mean, it would be a chunk of change every year, interest on that would go to tribes and put them in the driver's seat. They don't have to present a proposal to the public education department for what they want to do. I mean, there is reporting required. I mean, they have to share their plans and they have to say how they spent the money, and they have, there's some accountability measures in there around that, but they don't have to ask for permission to implement a certain program. That's my understanding of it. For those public dollars. And what is the argument around why that's important?
I mean, I think we really have to look back like a couple hundred years to get at the importance of it. And I think, starting in 1819, the federal government removed Native children from their homes, sent them to federal boarding schools designed to assimilate them to US white culture. And that was a policy that continued for 150 years. And the Interior Department put out an initial report in 2022 that found that New Mexico had the third highest concentration of those boarding schools. But even after that policy ended about 50 years ago, there's still this issue of state and federal control over education funding has really made it virtually impossible for tribes to really build out their own programs to educate their own children. And so that's Representative Linty and other advocates for the Tribal Education Trust Fund. I think that's one of their big arguments. But then also looking at Yazzie Martinez and poor academic outcomes for Native kids in the state, that this is really one of the major things that we have to do if we want to improve that.
Mm-hmm.
I think in addition to that, I mean, I think you covered a little bit of this, Bella, is that sometimes PED wouldn't ask. I mean, it was slow moving. So sometimes it would distribute funds to tribes about halfway through the fiscal year, right? And it would not give the tribes as much time to actually sit there and think about how they could spend the money, which is why some of the money is unspent. So it was a lot of control exhibited by the state And to your point around, and I'm going to try to find these stories and maybe put it in our chat so you can see, we've done some reporting on the boarding schools, but this stuff that you're talking about, this being a problem that has existed for centuries, is it's not like powerful people haven't known about this, because this is something I learned. It's a lot of us don't know this history, but in 1928 you had the Marion report that was presented to Congress saying, hey, look, you know, the way that we're handling tribal education is not the best, actually, and we're doing a disservice to indigenous children, which was followed up in 1969 by the Kennedy report, which again to Congress, which that's when I think, Marjorie, and you can help us with this history, but that's when you really start seeing some you know, this movement to take more control of education as well as other parts by the tribes and indigenous people across the country back in the 60s and 70s. So this is a long-standing issue here in the U.S. and in New Mexico.
Yeah, and I feel like I've actually heard the word assimilation used in committee hearings by lawmakers and advocates around why this is important, because the education programming, that this is my understanding, it's not just about teaching reading and math. It's actually having the ability to create education programs for Native students around their own histories, their own cultures, their own kind of government, the way their governments and cultures function. Is to really like have education systems that are actually located within tribal lifeways and culture and history and government structures that they're not going to pick up necessarily in public education in Albuquerque, or the way you know New Mexico's public education works. We have a question about pipeline programs, and I think so maybe we should back up a little bit to SB. I keep forgetting the number 39. That is a pipeline. I mean, a lot of that is geared towards, not just all of it, but a lot of it is geared towards pipeline work to expand a pipeline into for teachers who are bilingual. It's like bilingual education, Native teachers, and that is very connected, right, to like having education systems that work for, you know, students, Hispanic students too, you know, because there's been studies that show that when you have teachers that look like you and are from your culture and your background, that students they're more likely to learn. So Bella, I mean, do you want to talk a little bit more about the pipeline issues in that bill and in your previous reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, you just touched on a little bit kind of the importance of students having teachers who are representative of the student population. You know, I interviewed a student, Brooke Chavez, who is a junior here in high school in Albuquerque in the fall of 2022. And she had taken a Navajo language class the previous year. And you know, the way she talked about it was really like it was the most meaningful kind of educational experience she'd ever had. And that kind of prior to that class, she kind of felt out of place at school. I think her particular high school, I think had, I think maybe 4% of the student body had tribal affiliations. And so, you know, she talked about, you know, being called names. And so, you know, when she went to this Navajo language class, like she really felt like she belonged. And the teacher of that class, who I talked with him too, and he that was his kind of message too, was that he hears that from his students all the time, that you know, they come to his class and it's kind of like a reprieve from everything else they experience in school, and that they, you know, they felt like they belonged. And yeah, that class too, you know, it was a Navajo language class, but I think, you know, over the winter they had you know, there's a focus, you know, on you know, she got to, you know, wear like traditional clothing as part of the like curriculum for the class. And she just talked about how meaningful that was for her, and how that's maybe something that she wouldn't have, been able to experience if not for that class. And I can't, I'm trying to find the exact numbers right now, but there's just, APS doesn't have anywhere near the number of native language teachers that they would need to serve all Indigenous students in the district. And, back a couple years ago when I did talk to district officials, they were working on some pipeline initiatives, but I think the kind of my takeaway was that it just needed to be scaled up a whole lot more.
Right.
So that's some of what this bill is getting at.
I mean, it kind of, so there's the pipeline, so this bill, it distributes money to UNM, to NMSU, to Highlands, Navajo Technical College, Dene College, Northern New Mexico College. So it's sending out money, to all these different universities to develop these programs. But the APS, and I was brewing on it back then, and I continue to brew on it, is, the Tribal Education Trust Fund, I sometimes wonder how tribally run education can meet the needs of students at APS, because there is such a huge population of Native students who live in Albuquerque. They don't live, in their pueblos or out on, Navajo. They live actually in Albuquerque. So how to factor in meeting those children's needs around education, which is it's just a huge population. It's a really large population of Native students.
Yeah, I think from listening to the committees already, because the Tribal Education Trust Fund, Representative Lunty was trying to push for it last year and ended up tabling it. But from listening to some of those conversations between lawmakers, it was interesting. I think there was some confusion about, well, would this trust fund replace the Indian Education Fund? And, Lunty's response was absolutely not. They are two separate things. A lot of the issues with the Tribal Education Fund that Tripp touched on earlier about, PED being slow to distribute is part of the reason why we need this trust fund, is the way that Lunty explains it. But that, even if this trust fund was created, that doesn't, remove any responsibility that PED, that the state has to Native students throughout the state. And so that's kind of why, no, the trust fund wouldn't replace the Indian Education Fund, because the Indian Education Fund, school districts can also get funding under that act and that separate fund. So I think,
can I take a step back for a second and talk about why maybe they're talking about creating this kind of endowment right now for Tribal Education Fund, which is, as many of you know on the call, and maybe people who watch the recording later, New Mexico is, reporting record surpluses because the oil and gas industry is just, there's a lot of production here. And as we know, those of us who followed the state budget over many years, that's the largest industry in New Mexico, and it's a boom bust industry. So in good years, it really creates surpluses because the oil and gas industry contributes 40 to 45% of the state budget. So when you have a bust, you don't have as much money to go around. But if you create these large endowments that produce interest, the thinking is in the future years, maybe when oil and gas drops in its production and therefore also drops in state revenues, you'll have something to ameliorate or soften that financial blow. I just wanted to put that in context.
Yeah, and I think that's, very helpful context for sure. That's something that I've already, heard. That's a huge piece of the kind of the push for the Tribal Education Trust Fund. That's, Lunty's big argument is that this is the time to do it. And if we, as lawmakers, if we miss this opportunity, then that's on us. And that was a really big kind of source of conflict during the last session when he was pushing for it, which last year he was seeking a $50 million investment. And there was a lot of conversation about whether that was going to be enough money for every tribe in the state. And so there was some kind of, discussion about or argument about how much money each tribe was going to get. And that's part of why he ended up kind of tabling the proposal last year and bringing it back this year. But there was, that's a huge piece of the argument, of course, I think.
Mm-hmm. So we have a couple of we have a comment and more questions. So should we just move to a couple of those?
Sure, we can try to handle them, and we can, yeah.
We won't know all the answers to some of these, but first, Bill Bright says, I'm sure there are data connecting low income and poverty to lack of graduation and proficiency numbers. We can throw money at education, but if there is not successful efforts to reduce the extremes of wealth and poverty, there won't be much change. A catch-22 in that better education levels lead to improved personal income.
This is a very large conversation. A very large, I mean, that's an observation. I think, Marjorie, can I just make some observations about the connections that this commenter is making? As long as I've been in New Mexico, I've been here since 2005 and covered, mainly it's been around state government and legislature. There has been a very large, a big picture, long-term conversation about how to diversify the state's economy, by which we mean also creating jobs, more jobs out of one or two. Or the largest employers in the state, let me back up and say oil and gas and government. Those are generally the ones that I hear about. And there's been a lot of conversation about how to diversify the economy to actually create more jobs and expand outside those industries. That is sort of related to the question, the observation that is the commenter is making. As far as redistribution of wealth, I don't know if that's a part of it.
I mean, yeah, so
yeah.
we've been talking a little bit in MID around so there's all of these other things. So first of all, I want to say yes, New Mexico has a large number of low-income students, and they are also a huge constituency in the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit. And, there have been, and it's important to know how schools aren't just about teaching reading and writing. Lawmakers have also passed laws to make sure there's universal meals for students statewide. I mean, basically our schools feed children. There's school-based health centers that are sometimes the place that everyone in a community gets healthcare out in rural New Mexico in particular. So schools are a place where a lot of the needs are met for students and communities around food and health too. And these budgets, the education budget is geared, it encompasses all of these things. So it's a really important piece of actually caring for low-income children is the school budget, the education budget. But the lawmakers have also, when it comes to redistributing wealth, I mean, I'm not sure how much it redistributes, but progressive lawmakers on the progressive side of the equation at the State House have passed a series of laws over since 2019 that have made our tax code more progressive. They've increased the working families tax credit. They've, restructured the income tax rates. They're trying to do more of that. And I was listening in on a presentation last month nationally, looking at how states are doing in terms of having a progressive tax rate that shows that New Mexico has really increased its progressivity. And what that means is that people on the lower income of the income scale don't pay a higher percentage of their incomes in a whole mix of taxes taken together than wealthy people do. So they are actually working on making sure that those rates or at least have parity with wealthy people, if not lower the tax rates. It's really complicated, but no, your point is taken for sure on that, because it's education is so tied to future earnings.
Right. Education attainment. I was going to say that. That's exactly right. Education attainment is tied to lifelong earnings, lifelong, and how much one can earn. So, yeah, that's Marjorie, at some point, maybe we need to think about doing a Zoom conversation throughout the year, once a month, on big topics like this, because these are really, I'm not committing us folks to
So we
that. But
can get some experts on.
yeah, I mean, honestly, these are really important
Yeah.
questions. And this is the sort of conversations one will hear in the hallways at the roundhouse and or in committees during, the period when they're not in session throughout the year. You will hear these very large conversations about these kinds of things, which is why I find covering the legislatures and whatnot so interesting, because there are some really big and rich conversations going on behind the scenes, and in public too. Can I respond to Frank Lito's question about early childhood? And Frank, this may not.
What is the question? You want to
It
read?
is, yes, I will. Thank you for prompting me. What are you hearing about early childhood plans? I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer. I will be able to answer specifically what you're talking about. Marjorie or Bella might be able to help more, but what I do know is that when they started the Early Childhood Trust Fund several years ago, they were going to put aside, I think, 300 million, and there was a mechanism, like if they had so much money over a certain amount of current year expenses, they would put a percentage of that into Early Childhood Trust Fund. They were thinking that they would be able to grow it to maybe $1 billion in several years. That was 4 or 5 years ago, right, Marjorie, when they started this? Right now, there are projections showing that in a couple of years, that trust fund might grow to $9 billion.
Yeah, it's just been booming.
But because of oil and gas production. And so there may be some questions around in the legislature, short to middle term. Is there a way to divert some of that money to other agencies that might need that money? $9 billion is a lot of money. It would produce a lot of interest. If you're earning, say, 7 to 8%, you're kind of getting, can't do it in my head very quick, but you're kind of earning close to $500-600 million a year for an agency and a population. If you have 9 billion, is there going to be some kind of conversation in the legislature and among the financial types? Do we divert some of this money to other agencies that might need this? Actually, it's a very interesting conversation, frankly. But because early childhood, I think the research is kind of clear now. If you spend more on early childhood, you will see some effects a generation or two later. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, Frank, but it certainly is a big topic.
Why don't we, in the interest of time, so we have some questions from Wendy Linebrink Allison. Wendy, we don't have a specific numbers of some of these specific numbers, but they're really interesting questions. So she asks, it would be interesting to learn how much of the PED budget is spent on administration versus teachers, and if there is an inequity of where the dollars are going. I might be able to do a little bit of math or find that data, and if I'm able to do that, I will follow up with you on that, because that's an interesting question. And then you also ask about special education. Special education is really in need of an overhaul. You say it would be interesting to learn how many youth that have DD, ID, MH, gifted services, et cetera, are a percentage of those that are not graduating and dropping out of school. I think that's also that percentage point, we ought to be able to find that also. But I do want to say on that, when I was listening in on the priorities of PED in the coming year, special education was number 2 on the list of like the big priorities that the secretary emphasized to the LFC. And that included, in their budget request, they have money to pay for salary differentials for special education and other hard to fill positions. So, but improving special education services, they emphasized implementing a structured literacy program statewide, continuing to focus on that. And then the second piece that he really focused in on was the need to improve special education. So, I mean, I think it's definitely on their radar. And some of the other things, 11 million for special initiatives. for professional development, et cetera.
I mean, part of the context for that, Marjorie, is as you recall, because we did reporting on this. I mean, when Yazzie Martinez came down, special education students were that was a group that was wrapped into this ruling by the judge, which was you have non-English speakers, you have indigenous students, you also special ed. So I think that's in part flowing from Yazzie Martinez, frankly. There's a recognition. And if you read, I'm going by memory here, but if you read, and we might want to post this again, Marjorie, actually, but if you read, for those nerds who like to read a lot of like pages, but if you read the 600 pages of findings of fact from that Yazzie Martinez stuff, you will find special education students mentioned a lot in those findings. And that actually has helped us understand maybe like spending, how people are talking about education up at the legislature. If you read Judge Singleton's ruling, but also the findings of fact, I have to be full disclosure, I didn't read all 600 pages, but I read enough to know that special education students were mentioned often.
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge need, and there's a lot of different types of needs under that umbrella. But I would say there's like big infrastructure needs around special education to meet the needs of, students with disabilities and whatnot. I mean, schools themselves are often just not fully accessible, so it's a really good question, Wendy.
Yeah, the question around, especially around graduation rates, how many of those folks are maybe falling through the cracks? Who knows? We don't know. Somebody may know, but we don't.
So, I think any other questions? I think we hit all the questions.
You guys have given us more to think about than maybe we have helped you. So, I mean, this is, I'm self-deprecatory, but I mean, it's like these are really good questions,
So any other comments or questions from any attendees? We would love to hear them. And Bella, do you have anything else that you want to, because it's 1:17, we should start wrapping up.
I don't think so, unless anyone has a question, but.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us today, Bella.
Oh, Frank asked, what's the next topic?
Oh, we're trying to narrow that down now, but I think we're going to be joined next week by Gwyneth Doland. So I imagine Gwyneth Doland is someone who's been a reporter for us off and on over the years. She's focused in on redistricting for us, and done a lot of other kind of good government area reporting for us. And she's now, a professor of practice at UNM School of Journalism, and you probably often see her on KNME, New Mexico in Focus as well. She's a correspondent there, if anyone who doesn't know who Gwyneth is. So we're going to be joined by her. So I imagine we're going to be delving into some of the proposals around transparency, reforming some of our kind of ethics laws. That area, I suspect, will be on the agenda with Gwyneth next week, unless she has something else burning that she wants to talk about. But that's kind of what we're thinking, and we will confirm that next week, early next week.
And we'll send out an email telling you what it is.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming. We certainly appreciate it, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Bye.
Marjorie. Thanks, Bella. Thanks, Bettina, for operating everything behind the scenes.